Thank you very much. I would like to give you a presentation, but it's a little bit more targeted because the planning of ports is a very vast subject, and you have already given us certain bullet points that you want us to discuss today. So I am not going to talk about intermodalities and links with land. I'm going to concentrate on the way in which we actually plan ports in the sea areas, maritime areas. In this next slide, you can see some of the things that are economically at stake in the Mediterranean. The French Mediterranean, has more than 200 ports in it, but there are two very different economies that are present because we have one big naval port, which is the one in Marseille, and we have 8 little trading ports that are decentralized and that generate an economy that stems from either industry or from cruise ships. That's Toulon, Nice, Sète, Port La Nouvelle, Corsica, Ajaccio, Bastia, Porto Vecchio, and Rousse Island, Île Rousse. So this very industrial or the passenger industry represents almost 30% of the merchant traffic in metropolitan France. It amounts to 95 millions of tons, 51 that are oil products. The big port in Marseille amounts to 86% of the total activities in the Mediterranean. There are several decentralized ports that are becoming more and more important, such as Port La Nouvelle, which is where there is great wind potential, and Sète. We also have a lot of traffic, a lot of passengers that are transported in the Mediterranean, more than 42% of metropolitan traffic, transporting some 12.7 million passengers. The cruise ships have been multiplied three times, at least before the corona pandemic. So these are the industrial and the cruise ship industries. But we talked about 200 ports. We have 9 industrial ports. So all of the rest, therefore, are fishing ports and are marinas. You find them mostly in the Côte d'Azur. We have more than 130 very small ports, marinas. They are exclusively given over to little traditional jobs, to pleasure sailing. And this is a parallel economy, parallel to industry and cruise ships. It represents a turnover that is colossal for the Mediterranean facade, and it's a very significant economic sector. I've taken time to explain this to you because you cannot handle marine spatial planning the same way if you're talking about trading ports as opposed to Mediterranean coastal pleasure ports. So how are we going to handle with ports when it comes to marine spatial planning? In the Mediterranean, the problem that we are confronted with is with a lot of these port infrastructures is that they've been there for a long time. There was an explosion in ports from the 1950s up until 1995. And it was in 1995 that we saw that there was more and more artificialization, and we realized what the impact was. But those big ports that have existed for more than 30 years have already produced their consequences. And we have to manage those consequences and try to win back the natural milieu. And that is why it makes MSP something that is very specific to ports. This planning is to try to preserve the cross-cutting economy, which is essential in the Mediterranean basis. So we want to reduce the impacts of artificialization that will be generated by future port infrastructures, and secondly, to also decrease the number of harmful elements that could exist, and to strengthen or to flesh out links to the territory. And I'm not really going to talk about links to the territory today. In the following slide, we're going to take a deeper dive into our first objective, which is to better plan ports to decrease the impact of artificialization. In the French Mediterranean, you have to imagine that the coastal artificialization rate is greater than 10%. We're talking here about 5,000 hectares that have been reclaimed from the sea. It's 5% of the small coastal lands that have been irreversibly destroyed because of these works built on reclaimed land. So all of the functions that have to go to the nurseries, the spawning basins and so forth, all of these types of things that made the services, the coastal services necessary have been destroyed irreversibly. And yet, today, if we are forward looking and if we look at all of the blue economy sectors that we are aiming at, the offshore wind farms, hydraulic installations, other installations for renewable energy, such as thermal installations, everything that has to do with low carbon emitting energy. If you're building platforms or hydrogen supply platforms, you are, in all those cases, going to have a greater rate of artificialization, and the port structures will have to adapt to those future activities. So the question that we are wondering about, the basic question, when you're doing any integrated marine planning, is how are we going to accompany that artificialization that is destructive but necessary so that it can be more or less sustainable, or at least may sustain as few negative impacts as possible. In the following slide, I would like to give you an example as to how we answer these questions. In France, we can answer it in two ways. The first is to give priority to the projects, and in that way, we can have a strategy of a facade strategy of artificialization. In this way, we can identify the projects that will be priority ones, which are the ones that are of true public interest, what spaces need to be protected, what spaces must absolutely not be artificialized, either because they are naturally important or because it would be very risky and it would be criminal to artificialize them. So the first thing that we want to do is to integrate the port infrastructures in a more global approach, and to say that artificialization has to be prioritized. We have to aim for net zero artificialization. We must identify if we see something that is of public interest, we have to artificialize, but try to reach a zero net artificialization rate. The second way of the second approach is to ask the different ports to come up with avoidance measures or reduction measures or compensation measures that will offset the damage. And thanks to that, we will strengthen the financial participation of the project owners. They'll be more involved in the follow-through of ecosystems, of the management of zones to be protected, and we will ask them to systematically work on the eco-design when they're working on their projects. On the next slide, I'd like us to take a look at two concrete examples of ports that have adopted this approach. The first is the Port Vendres port, which is found in Occitania. It's very close to the Spanish border. Port Vendres is the second biggest port in France, and it needs to diversify the merchant vessel activity. They also need to give added value to the cruise ship activity, which is ever increasing, while preserving the traditional fishing and yachting ports, marinas. There's been a lot of discussion as to how we should be saying yes or no to these infrastructures that are necessary to the economic good of a town. So in order to come up with this new key, we have dragged 17,000 cubic meters. We have done 5,000 cubic meters of rock excavation. And it has destroyed 4,000 square meters of Posidonia meadow and 1,000 square meters of dead mat. So this we authorized this project, but with certain underlying conditions. The first was they would have to create microhabitats for young fish, artificial nurseries in all of the port installations, and we asked that the department as well create a mooring zone in a bay that is next door to the port so that the boating activities no longer destroyed land. And we said, all right, you will be able to destroy this amount of the habitat as long as you recreate something similar in close proximity. And in the following slide, you can see this on a map. On the right, you've got the Portland. On the right, you've got the old quay. It's a tiny little quay. It was Port Vendre was a little town. And in grey, you've got what will be the new quayside. And you can see that the works are very important, and it's going to completely change the town's economy. Therefore, the environmental impact has to be well managed. On the next slide, you actually have examples of some of the things that have been created to offset the loss of Posidonia meadow and the loss of the fishing nurseries. We have artificial nurseries, either as a cage, like Biohut that was built by Ecosyon, or in the form of vertical cages, such as you can see in the second second photo by Seaboost. The second example I want to talk about is that of La Ciotat. Normally, these were shipbuilding yards, and La Ciotat wants to become the first eco-yachting port in France. So it's important for us to step in behind that. Once again, yachting is a very important part of marine activities, and this is a very historic port for us. So what La Ciotat wants to do is to create a lift, a boat lift, that will be able to lift 4,000 tons, similar to the one that exists in Marseille, and therefore unique in the world. In order to do so, La Ciotat had to create 250 meters of new quays, new quaysides, and therefore to do that, they had to do rock excavation, they had to drag polluted sediments right in the middle of the national park of Lake Calanque. So that too was authorized, but they had to create a fish nursery that would cover 600 square meters and that would be unique in the world. That is something that will be done by Seaboost. So they had to therefore create a habitat that had actually disappeared in La Ciotat, but we can recreate it artificially thanks to nurseries. And you can see the photo on the left-hand side. This will be the largest nursery in the world, 600 square meters. It's the same principle as what we saw in the previous example. It will actually create something that will look very much like a reef. Our second objective is to better plan, to decrease obstacles and to integrate ports in towns. Plans, therefore, have to go hand in hand with an economy, but an economy that is sustainable. Plans have to allow for the creation of infrastructures. We have to be able to accompany all of the ports so that they can adopt some type of proactive approach in favor of biodiversity. And we also must support public interest projects, the support of the state, of municipalities. And the second thing that we want to do is to help the ports be much more, to create infrastructures that will welcome renewable marine energies with fuels that give out fewer emissions. Now, these are the two things that I would like to talk about very quickly now. On this slide, I'd like to talk about Port La Nouvelle, which is a port that has chosen to increase its size so that it can receive larger vessels, particularly vessels that will be working in the offshore wind farm sector. This port is to be found just opposite what will be a future commercial offshore wind park, and there is a need to adapt this to the wind farm sector. So the southern dike will be extended by 600 meters. A new dike of 2,430 meters will be built, and this will necessitate dragging over 3.5 hectares. That is going to damage the Bento Demersal community and all of the fish spawning and fish nurseries in the area. It will also damage the great mother of pearls. But this project has been accepted, and as long as they transplant the mother of pearl populations towards a neighboring swamp, the swamp of Airol, they also have to create a research on mother of pearl, a research program, and they must create a zone that protects the sandy bottoms of the sea, and that is something that is ongoing at the moment. So you can see that here too there is an offset. La Ciotat, there is an exceptional nursery infrastructure because it's big. Whereas in Port La Nouvelle, we are creating fish nurseries, we're transplanting, we're creating a research program. And as time goes by and as we become more familiar with the impact of these port infrastructures, we are increasing the number of things that we're discovering that we can do. And the project owners are having to compensate the damage that they do to the environment, more and more so these days, because of the artificialization brought about by their projects. And this is what it looks like on a plan, on a map. On the left, you've got an old image of Port La Nouvelle. You can see those two little dikes. That's the former port. Down the bottom, in brown, you can see what the old port looked like, and we can hardly see the two old dikes. So there is a complete change, and an enormous amount of the surface is reclaimed from the sea. My second example concerning this policy of environmentalizing the ports has to do with a certification, a biodiversity certification. I've talked a lot about trading ports because being the ones that generate an economy, they are the ones that are coming up, that are tabling the most projects and are finding arguments to justify them. In the Mediterranean, we also have some 200 leisure ports, 200 yachting marinas, and that represents very important infrastructures as well, and it's essential for the economy of the territory. In the Mediterranean, that is something that is very significant. The Port Propre, the Clean Port Certification, is something that has been done with the PACA region and the state, and it allows a port or a historical degradation into something that will help restore the ecosystem and manage the surrounding marine space. This certificate is one that the port will obtain once they have decreased their rejects, their emissions, once they have tabled a collective water management policy with, for example, the sports clubs, with ideas for proper mooring facilities and so forth, and awareness-raising programs. And this means that all of the little yacht harbors haven't necessarily asked for any greater artificialization or to extend their surface area. But that's interesting to note, because all of these actors, in asking for the certification, can become proactive, working in favor of biodiversity in their region, and thus creating a virtuous port. And this brings me to my conclusions. These are just little avenues for exploration, or these are just little bullet points, take-home messages. As I explained, the artificialization, the greatest level, the peak of artificialization and the creation of port infrastructures was reached in 1985. And since then, there has been a very clear slowdown. Public authorities have to make do with the situation, and they therefore are setting up a strategy that targets port infrastructures. They are prioritizing projects that are of public interest or that are vital for the economy. They accompany these projects, but factoring the environment in much more today, thanks to the ERC sequence and research and innovation. They are also making the project owners much more responsible for what they do. They become financial partners, technical partners of management, and they are also recognizing all of these ports as true actors in the players in the territory. They are players who are positive, they are capable of restoring via their infrastructures, and they are capable of working in favor of biodiversity. Thank you very much.